the work I do is part people and part transactional process. So how we transact, and the other half is how we align people to transact successfully. And that mentor I mentioned before, Roger, he had a significant impact on me as a leader and how I lead and how I develop culture and develop people. And there's an interesting phenomenon that you can't change a culture until the critical mass of the culture has reached sufficient dissatisfaction.
That's fair.
Yeah. And
is it bad enough yet? Right. That's kind of the question, right? Is it bad enough for us to make the changes we need to make?
Yeah. And so it's interesting because political differences and viewpoints aside, in the last election, I got on the phone with my dad, and he's heard me talk about this. I've talked to him. I have a good relationship with my father. We've talked a lot about this kind of stuff. I share with him what I do. And after the last election, I said, it's clear America hasn't reached sufficient dissatisfaction. After the most recent election, apparently America reached sufficient dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
Right? So it's, again, whether you like it, whether you are a dissatisfied one or whether you're not a dissatisfied one, it's clear the critical mass has reached sufficient dissatisfaction based on the most recent outcome of the election. So,
well, it's like anything, right? If you're going to make real change, only comes when there's enough pain. Period.
Yeah.
If things are good, why would you change?
Totally.
So.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing as a leader. I was asked once, said, Bill, so you're telling me that as leaders, we're going to create sufficient dissatisfaction amongst the people? I'm like, that's exactly what I'm telling you. They said, well, how's that different than manipulation? And it was a great question. I was like, man, this is awesome. And jokingly, I was like, we got a verbal judo match right now, right?
Right.
But it was a great question, and it was one that I hadn't thought about before, but the answer was pretty clear, and it came out pretty quick. And I said, as leaders, we lead with positive intent. And if you're manipulative, you're leading with malice.
Okay.
And that's really the difference in the business, is that if you're creating sufficient dissatisfaction to help shepherd this group of people into something better, that's creating sufficient dissatisfaction, and it's leading with a positive intent, and it's much different than manipulating.
It's interesting you say that, because when I was doing sales training, a lot of what we did was using different forms of psychology, and whether that was transactional analysis or neurolinguistic programming. And we would always get the question of, well, isn't this manipulation? And my response was always, yes, it absolutely is. But, because there's a but there, manipulation is not always a bad thing, right? Like, I can manipulate this microphone. That's manipulating. It's movement, right? I'm changing it. I'm making a change with positive intent. And I do think that intent, and when it comes to manipulation, I do think that intent matters. But I think that almost all things, anytime there are two humans interacting, there is manipulation happening in some form, whether you realize it or not. True. You may be going into it thinking like, I need to make them do this thing I need them to do because it's blah, blah, blah. And yeah, that's bad. But manipulation has over time become such a term used with such a negative connotation that the good side of manipulation. So like, if I'm a football coach and I walk into that locker room and I start giving that pep talk, that is 1000% manipulation.
You bet.
Right? But I'm getting these kids motivated to go out there and win the football game and do the things they need to do. And it's with positive intent, but still manipulation. So it's whenever people bring up manipulation, I'm like, well, it's not always a bad thing. Manipulation's not a bad thing unless you're trying to do it for, ill means. So it's the end in mind, I guess, right?